So this is part 2 of our theme on Pride and Prejudice, and what I am going to do is I am going to show you 3 different adaptations of the story. 2 of them are a retelling, and 1 of them is a sequel. And the reason that I am sharing these with you today is because I love the story of Pride and Prejudice so much that I go out and I look for different ways to enjoy the story after I've actually read the original. So something that's unique about Pride and Prejudice is that it's in the public domain, which means that people are allowed to use the characters and the story to make their own stuff and be able to profit from it. There is nobody that they have to pay to use the story. So because of that, there are a ton of different adaptations, retellings, sequels, that kind of stuff. I can't even tell you how many different ways people have used this story. TV movies, regular big blockbuster movies, there's, Pride and Prejudice and zombies, there's a whole bunch of different ways that people have used this story. So I'm going to show you 3 of my favorites. The first one is a YouTube show called the Lizzie Bennet Diaries, and this is what their channel looks like. So the Lizzie Bennet Diaries stays very true to the actual book, but just tells it in a more modern way. So Lizzie Bennet, instead of Elizabeth, is the main character here, and she uses a vlog to talk about the things that happen in her life. And all of them are very similar to what happens to Elizabeth in Pride and Prejudice, only it's a little bit more modern. So instead of the problems that happen in the early 1800s, they are things that could happen today. It's modern things that happen, and I really like it. It's one of the first things that I go to after I finish reading or listening to the book. So I really suggest going with the Lizzie Bennet Diaries if you are looking for kind of a quick way to get the story and it's a little bit more modern and a little bit more relatable. The second thing that I'm going to talk about is this book called Death Comes to Pemberley by P.D. James, who is this cute little lady right here. So Death Comes to Pemberley, the first time that I ever came across Death Comes to Pemberley was when I was looking on Netflix and I saw Death Comes to Pemberley on Netflix. It's actually a 3-part miniseries on Netflix that follows the same idea as the book Death Comes to Pemberley. And if we're very honest, I like it better than the book, because the Death Comes to Pemberley is a sequel to Pride and Prejudice. It follows Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy after they are married, and they have 2 sons, and they live together at Pemberley, and Elizabeth is not as big of a character in Death Comes to Pemberley as I really wished that she would have been. The story centers around Mr. Darcy trying to make sure that Pemberley is saved because Lydia and Mr. Wickham are traveling to Pemberley to go to a ball that they were not invited to, or at least that's the story. And they have a companion, his name is Mr. Denny, and Captain Denny is a friend of Mr. Wickham's, and he's very angry with Mr. Wickham, and so during their travel through Pemberley Wood, Mr. Denny gets out of the carriage and Mr. Wickham goes after him. Eventually, Mr. Denny ends up dead, and Wickham is the prime suspect. So the problem is that, first of all, it happened at Pemberley on, their grounds. Second of all, Lydia is the sister of Mrs. Darcy, Elizabeth. Third of all, Wickham grew up on Pemberley, or at Pemberley. So there's a lot of connections to Pemberley, and there is a problem that arises, which is that if it's true that Mr. Wickham is actually the murderer, that this will paint Pemberley in a very bad light, and nobody wants that to happen. So Mr. Darcy is on a mission to clear Mr. Wickham from the charges, and it's a very good book. It's more of a mystery than I thought it was going to be, and I would read it again. The only thing that I really didn't like about the book is that it involves a lot less of Darcy and Elizabeth together. They probably only talk to each other like 4 or 5 times during the entire book, which is a little bit of a bummer because everybody really likes the relationship between Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy. So when you get a sequel, your hope is that you're going to see a lot more interactions between them, but actually Darcy is a lot more interested in clearing Pemberley's name. And if you have Netflix, I would suggest watching that, or you can also pick up the book. The last one that I'm going to talk about is another book. And this book, I just finished reading it. It's called Pride. And I don't actually have the copy of it because my sister is reading it now. But I will pull up a picture of it so you can see what the cover looks like. So this is what the cover looks like of the book. It's called Pride, and you can see here the author, her name is, and I'm just probably not going to say this very well, but Ibizoboi, Ibizoboi. And she writes about Zuri Benitez and her family. They are an African-Latino, or Afro-Latino family who live in a neighborhood in New York. Zuri is our Elizabeth, and she is a senior in high school, or about to be a senior in high school when this book takes place. And her main concern, something that is really weighing on her, is that her neighborhood, which she loves with all her heart, is really starting to change, and it's starting to become a lot more uniform, or it's starting to become a lot more hipster, a lot more like New York. And she doesn't really like that. She doesn't like the money that's coming into the neighborhood because she likes it the way it is. She likes the diversity, and she likes her neighbors, and it has a lot of kind of ethnic and cultural pieces that pulls into the story that I really, really liked. So the main kind of problem that Zuri has is that a new family is moving in across the street, and they have poured tons and tons of money into renovating this massive house across the street. And the family is the Darcy family. And instead of being called Mr. Darcy, because that'd be really weird for like a 17-year-old boy, Zuri, her neighbor across the street, they have 2 sons. So the Darcys have an older son that is kind of taking the place of Mr. Bingley, and then we have Darius Darcy, who is our Mr. Darcy of the series. And this story is less true to the actual problems of Pride and Prejudice. It's a much more modern take. It is way more young adult. I think if you were going to, like, my audience is mostly young adults, and so I would say if you were looking for a first step into reading a book that has a Pride and Prejudice theme, I think Pride would be a really cool place to start. It has, you know, a lot more cultural and ethnic notes to it that are really, really cool, and it's really fun to look at how Zuri handles her problems, and it's not as obvious to make the connections to Pride and Prejudice, but when you find the ways that the author is connecting Pride and Prejudice to her novel, it becomes really obvious when you figure it out. You're like, oh, of course. You know, instead of having a really rich and snobby aunt, Darius has a rich and snobby grandma, and I just really liked the book. It was a really quick read. I read it in about 2 sittings, I think, and it was really fast-paced, which is good because that probably means that I really liked it and it was easy to read, but there's also some times where I really wish that there was more detail, which I think is a good problem to have because it just means I wanted more of the story. And I was really interested in hearing more about Zuri and hearing more about Darius. And I think for a younger audience, Pride is a really good place to start if you're interested in Pride and Prejudice. So if you read or watch or listen to any of the recommendations that I've made today, let me know if you like them. I think if you are somebody who's interested in the Pride and Prejudice story, but you're a little bit intimidated by the actual book, all of the things that I've shown you today would be a really good place to dive in. So let me know.